Thank you very much for the welcome. I've been asked to read a short extract from this volume, and I've chosen a chapter entitled Crime and Punishment. A Scot ale or drinking party took place at Ashley, near Cirencester, on the 7th of September 1208. It was in honour of the birthday of Our Lady, and the local officer of the forest sold drinks at his alehouse to celebrate the occasion. It was essentially a form of local tax, because the inhabitants felt obliged to attend in fear of incurring his displeasure. John Scott was riding back from the alehouse when he invited Richard of Crudwell to sit behind him on his horse. Richard thought that he was offering him a lift, but John took up a knife and stabbed him in the shoulder. The wound was 4.5 inches deep. Richard fell from the horse and John dismounted. He stabbed Richard once more and proceeded to rob his purse of 43 shillings. Somehow Richard crawled home on all fours and on the next day informed the King's sergeant. This seems to have provoked John Scott, who 5 nights later broke into the house of Richard's mother and beat her so badly that it was believed she would not live. At a convent near Wotton, in the East Riding of Yorkshire, in the 1160s, one nun had lost her virginity to a young priest. When her condition became obvious, the nuns interrogated her about the offending man. When she revealed his identity, the nuns captured him. They took him to the cell of the pregnant nun. She was given a knife and forced to castrate her lover, whereupon the nuns stuffed his genitals into her mouth. She was then flogged and bound with chains in a prison cell. In an age when the call of heaven was direct and unequivocal, and when the spiritual world was preeminent, a general indifference was maintained to the fate or the sufferings of the physical body. When one English king was asked if he regretted the thousands of soldiers he had sent into slaughter, he remarked that they would thank him when they were in heaven. The chronicler, after telling the story of the savage nuns, exclaimed, "What zeal was burning in these champions of chastity, these persecutors of uncleanliness, who loved Christ above all things." The stories of physical cruelty would have been familiar to all the people of England in a period when violence was tolerated to a surprising degree. Village justice could be savage and peremptory, largely going unreported. The violence of lord against villain does not often appear in historical record. In this society, men and women took weapons with them. Even small children possessed knives. William Palfrey, aged 11, stabbed and killed the 9-year-old William Geezer outside the village of Whittlesford in Cambridgeshire. There was, in any case, what would now be called a culture of violence. Children were educated with severe physical discipline. Corporal punishment was familiar and usual in all elements of society. Public whipping for a variety of offences from adultery to slander was commonplace. A genuine pleasure was also derived from bitter disputation, denunciation, and vilification. This was a culture of rhetoric and the spoken word. A wide vocabulary of scatological abuse could be employed, while sexual misdemeanors were commonly and loudly publicized. In a society of intense hierarchy, a preoccupation with good name and standing is only to be expected. Disputes were sometimes settled by ritualized fights in the churchyard. Slights and insults were the occasion of bloody disputes. The smallest incident could provoke a violent fracas. One man came into a hostelry where strangers were drinking. "Who are these people?" he inquired, for which question he was stabbed to death. An element of gratuitous cruelty could also be introduced, as in the case of one man who was dragged to a local tavern and there obliged to drink a cocktail of beer and his own blood. So the incidence of criminality was great. The justices who travelled to Lincoln in 1202 were confronted with 114 cases of murder and 49 of rape. This is not to mention the scores of incidents of theft and assault. When the body of a murdered man was found, the men of the neighborhood were summoned, while the corpse was raised upon a wooden hurdle and exhibited for 7 days, with logs burning around it to provide recognition at night. All males over the age of 12 from the 4 nearest villages were summoned to an inquest. There was a popular phrase for a felon to become a wolf's head that anyone may cut down. He could be killed on sight by anyone who encountered him. Real wolves did in fact still inhabit 13th century England. They were not exterminated until 1290. In that year, Richard de Loverez was noted as holding land by the service of hunting the wolf in Hampshire, if one can be found. The wolf was deemed to be vermin, fit for nothing except death. So his fate was transferred to the unfortunate offender. If the life of the nation was harsh, so was the system of punishment and death. The stocks and the gibbet were the common properties of English life. Let him see a priest were the last words of the judge in a hanging matter. If you were convicted in Wakefield, you would be hanged. If you were found guilty in Halifax, your head would be cut off. Thieves, apprehended in Dover, were thrown over the cliffs. At Sandwich, they were buried alive in a place known as Thiefdown at Sandown. At Winchelsea, they were hanged in the Saltmarsh there. At Halifax, the axe would be drawn up on a pulley and then fastened with a pin to the side of the scaffold. If the prisoner had been caught in false possession of a horse or an ox, the animal was led to the scaffold with him. The beast was then tied to a cord that held the pin, and at the moment of judgment, the beast was whipped and the pin came out. The proceedings were accompanied by the plaint of a bagpipe. It was a very ancient practice, perhaps predating even the time of the Saxons. The ancient privilege of the private gallows was also in demand. By the old law of infang theof, a lord had the right to string up a thief caught in his property. In the early 13th century, 65 private gallows were set up in Devon alone. But the thieves were not always put to death. A young offender was often blinded and castrated instead. When, in 1221, Thomas of Eldersfield of Worcester was accused of malicious wounding, he was sentenced to the same punishment. The judges decreed that the relatives of the victim could perform the blinding and castration. They threw the eyeballs to the ground and used the testicles as little footballs. The apparent severity of the penalties was necessary in a violent society where relatively few offenders were caught. In the absence of a police force or a standing army, condign punishment was one of the few ways of upholding social obligations. That is why the local people were generally compelled to witness the performance of the sentence. The objective was to maintain order. The trial by water and the trial by ordeal were also considered to be acceptable punishment in criminal cases. Trial by ordeal was conducted under the auspices of the church. The accused spent 3 days in fasting and in prayer. On the 3rd day, in a secluded part of the church, a cauldron of water was brought to boiling point by fire. A stone or piece of iron was then placed in the water. The accuser and the accused, each one accompanied by 12 friends, were arranged in 2 lines opposite one another, with the cauldron in the middle. The participants were sprinkled with holy water by the priest. Some litanies were recited, and the water was once more checked to see that it was at boiling point. The accused then plunged his hand and arm into the water and took out the weight. The scalded flesh was then wrapped in a linen cloth. If the flesh had healed after the 3rd day, the accused was pronounced to be innocent. If the flesh was burned or ulcerous, the prisoner suffered the penalty for his offense. Another form of divination by water was practiced. A man or woman was bound and then lowered into a pit of cold water. The pit was 20 feet wide and 12 feet deep. The priest blessed the water and then called upon God to judge what is just and your right judgment. If the man began to sink, he was deemed to be innocent. If he was guilty, he floated. The blessed water had rejected him. The trial by fire was slightly more ingenious. The ceremony once more took place in a church. At the beginning of Mass, a fire was made and a bar of iron placed upon it. At the end of the Mass, the red-hot metal was taken to a small stone pillar. The accused then had to pick up the glowing metal and walk with it for 3 steps before throwing it down. The treatment was then the same as that of the trial, by boiling water. A strange mode of punishment, known as the ordeal of the morsel, was reserved for priests. A piece of cheese, 1 ounce in weight, was placed on a consecrated host. It was then given to the accused cleric on the solemn understanding that it would stick in his throat if he were guilty. The angel Gabriel was supposed to come down and stop the man's throat. It is not clear how this worked in practice. The concept of sanctuary was clearer. A felon who fled to one of a number of specified churches might remain inviolate for 40 days. No person might hinder anyone bringing food or drink to him. The church was watched closely during this period in case the man tried secretly to escape. After 40 days, the thief or murderer could formally be expelled by the archdeacon, but he could be permitted to stay. He could choose to abjure the realm, however, in which case he was taken to the church porch and assigned a port from which to sail. He was obliged to walk along the King's Highway, deviating neither to the left nor the right, carrying a cross in his hand. When he reached the port, he would seek passage within the time of 1 tide and 1 ebb. If that were not possible, he was to walk every day into the sea, up to his knees, until he found a ship. Violent crime was, of course, closely associated with the incidents of drunkenness. The English were well known throughout Europe for their addiction to ale and wine and cider. The French were proud, the Germans were obscene, and the English were drunkards. In English monasteries, the daily allowance was a gallon of strong ale and a gallon of weak ale. Every village had its alehouse. 12th century London was castigated by the chronicler William Fitzstephen for the immoderate drinking of fools. There was private as well as public drinking. The most flourishing trade among the women of an English village was that of brewing. It was one of the essential continuities of national life. The whole land, Roger of Hoveden wrote, is filled with drink and drinkers. The court rolls contain many stories of people who fell out of windows, slipped into cauldrons, tumbled from horses, or plunged into rivers as a consequence of drink. In 1250, Benedict Lothair had been drinking in a tavern in Henstead in Suffolk, and by the end of the session, he could neither walk nor ride, nor barely even stand up. His brother Roger put him on his horse. He fell off. Roger hauled him up a second time, and again Benedict fell off. Then Roger decided on a more drastic measure. He put him back on the horse and tied him onto the animal. Benedict slipped and fell off once more, killing himself in the process. John de Markby Goldsmith was drunk and leaping about in the house of a friend when he wounded himself fatally with his own knife. Alice Quernbetter, extremely drunk, called 2 workmen by the insulting name of Treadicales. She was then murdered by them. Richard Le Boer, carrying a bag of malt home while drunk, stumbled and ruptured himself. William Bonifant, Skinner, stood drunk, naked, and alone at the top of a stair for the purpose of relieving nature, when by accident he fell head down to the ground and died. The records of madness evince some of the general qualities of the medieval mind. Robert de Bramrick took his sister, deformed and hunchbacked from the time of her birth, and plunged her into a cauldron of hot water. Then he took her out and began stamping on her limbs in order to straighten them. When Agnes Fuller refused to have sex with Geoffrey Rich, he cut off her head with a sword. He informed his neighbours that he was a pig and hid beneath a trough. Eventually, he went home, found a needle and thread, and tried to sew Agnes's severed head back to the body. So, there we have it.
Thank you so much, Peter, for waking us all up this evening. That was a typically vivid, charismatic and gruesome, dare I say, excerpt from your work. I'm actually delighted you chose to read that passage. I didn't know what Peter was going to read this evening, because I confessed to him in the dressing room in a rather gushing way that Peter's brilliance is one of the reasons that I was inspired to become a historian originally when I read his Hawksmoor book when I was 13 or 14. And that has some pretty gruesome moments in it as well. Do you think you include this kind of detail in your work because the past was a visceral and vicious place, or have you got a sense of the macabre and it's what you try to dig out?
Well, I rather like the stories in any case, and certainly I have a sense of the macabre on most occasions. The motive in that chapter was not so much to emphasize the violence of society, but to try and understand the nature of the society which could create such violence and create the conditions in which people behaved in the way they did. I also like to think of it as a way of, how can I put it, comparing past and present. We've heard a lot in recent days about the London riots a couple of weeks ago, but of course they are nothing compared in contrast to the behavior of people, their ancestors 6 centuries ago.
What's interesting, I think, when you talk is that you often say you're not a historian, you're a reader, although a huge amount of your work, clearly the majority of it, lives in the past. I think that actually you're a true historian because history was invented in 5th century Greece by Herodotus as this thing called historiae. And historiae was a combination of myth, and analysis and inquiry, and landscape was incredibly important. And you always take us to the landscapes where history happened.
Yes, the first historians were poets, and I think you mentioned Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon have always been inspirations to me. I think to be a good historian, it's first necessary to be a good writer. You cannot hope to capture the drama and adventure of history unless you're able to bring to it gifts of narrative form and of narrative style. I very much admire Gibbon and Macaulay for the same reasons. They seem to me to be great writers rather than great historians, but the two are obviously comparable in their cases. So I try to bring the insights which I've gained from the fiction, you mentioned Hawksmoor, and apply them to the historical world in a way which will dramatize and reinvent them for the audience.
And do you find, when you walk through London, for instance, because you've written about London, do you find that you are actually in 2 times at once?
Yes, sometimes you do get that very vivid impression. For me, history is not an academic discipline, it's a living presence, which is on some occasions palpable. I was wandering around Charlie Chaplin's old haunts in Kennington last Saturday, some of which have remarkably survived. And I was deeply conscious of being in a sort of dream of the late 19th century as well as being in the presence of the 21st century. It's an odd feeling because you see 2 places at once almost, and you see 2 peoples at once. But it's the only way, I believe, that you can connect the present to the past.
And does that, do you think, in a way, that also makes you more sympathetic to the characters that you're dealing with? Because there is always this danger, both with history and with historical fiction, when you write about real people, that people like us, historians, in a way we're cherry-picking their lives. You know, we're looking back and thinking, well, that was exciting, that was sensational, that was extraordinary. And actually, they can't speak up for themselves. They can't stop and say, no, it wasn't anything like that. I mean, do you feel that sense of responsibility when you're writing?
I do to a certain extent, but I also feel that sense of responsibility when dealing with fictional characters. People sometimes say to me, oh, did you like Richard III, or did you like Elizabeth I? But it's never a question of liking or disliking, it's a question of trying to understand them. And in that act of understanding, conveying the character and personality of that person to the audience. So it's not cherry picking, it's part of a more determined and inventive analysis of character.
And with this current project, which, of course, I think we should emphasise that this marvellous tome, The History of England, Volume 1, really is only volume 1.
Yes, I believe it is.
There are going to be 6 more.
5 more.
Well, yes, sorry, and of the same
Same weight.
weight. Very brave, very, very brave.
I don't think
man.
it's brave. I think it's a natural thing to do. It came to me by surprise as an idea. I didn't give it any forethought or calculation. I just wrote down the 6 volumes as they occurred to me, and then began the process. I think it's a natural thing to do after writing the life of London and Thames, and after writing several lives of historical figures. It seemed perfectly reasonable and justifiable to turn one's attention to the whole country. And people say to me, well, why haven't you included Scotland and Wales and so forth? Well, there's something, I think we all admit there's something distinctive about English government, English poetry, English art, English music. So why not try to examine the spirit and condition of the nation which provided the context for those achievements? I'm not apologizing for calling it History of England. I'm rather proud to have done that. And in the 6 volumes, I hope to bring the long story, the long song, alive to the general public.
And what is that song? Is it one song?
It's 2, I think. Well, there are 2. It's a counterpoint. On the one hand, I find in writing the history of medieval England and earlier England, pre-medieval, that the governing elements of life seem to be confusion, hesitancy, indecision, unintended consequence, force, farce, and mistakes. That's the surface. And I presume that as today we proceed from crisis to catastrophe without any particular pattern emerging to explain why that occurred. But underneath that surface chaos, there's a deep underlying and permanent continuity, almost a geological continuity, which is the land itself. That's why I've included chapters on medieval humor, medieval healing, medieval myths and rituals and customs and legends, because I wanted to bring across that solid identity which underlies all the mess and flux of day-to-day living.
I mean, it is so interesting that when you talk about the flux and the chaos and the confusion, I mean, and one of the apologies, as in defences of history, that's constantly wheeled out is that we must study more history, we must understand it, because it's only then that we can learn from the mistakes of others, otherwise we're destined to repeat it. I mean, you know, we all know this. But do you think, in a way, having looked at the lives of so many people of the past, actually, in order to live our own lives, we do have to make the same mistakes?
Oh, yes. Well, we do. I can't think of a decade, or let's say 50 years in English history, which does not, in some sense, replicate the activities of previous decade. It's not exactly a wheel, but there's a sort of, I don't know what you call that shape.
Yes, we need a physicist. It's what it does on a graph, doesn't it? Kind of convolutes. But is that depressing, though? Is it depressing?
No, not at all. It's liberating.
But why is it liberating?
Because we've survived. We've sustained a great civilization for 2,000 years, despite the chaos and confusion which exist on a day-to-day basis.
It's also, I think, a very sympathetic project, this, because, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but there does seem to me that as a nation, we are also very interested in our past.
Yes.
Do you think that's right?
Absolutely. Where else in the world would you have a huge success of a program devoted to archaeology?
Yeah,
Time Team is a great national blessing. I can't think of any other country in the world which would, perhaps, I don't know, but it's certainly a specific English taste, as with the sort of the TV historians, as with the successive programs like Who Do You Think You Are, and so forth. There's a great appetite for history and a great appetite for the past, and it's always been there. The antiquarian taste of the English has been present, for 400 or 500 years, with the work of Stukely and so forth. So, yes, there is an appetite for the past, but I think it's probably been, how can I put it, it's probably academic historians don't really engage with that taste, that appetite. They're more interested, I think, in talking to one another than in talking to the public. But I wanted to remedy that by writing what I would call a popular history, in which the life of the past is dramatized and reborn, as it were.
Just for your interest, Time Team obviously is very popular in the UK. It also sells hugely abroad, because I think everybody...
Oh, does it?
It does, because people want to think, they watch it to think how crazy the English are, that we go out for 3 days in the rain, you know, to dig up a potsherd. And that's it, you know, that's the climax of the programme. So I think it's very, I think it's done a lot for us, actually.
I know, it's a great show. I enjoy it immensely. I wouldn't miss it. It's a living example of the continuities of English life, because antiquarians and scholars and archaeologists were working on Stonehenge in 1500?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and do you think that there's a historical reason for that? Is it because famously, although of course we have had a difficult and traumatic history, we were famously last invaded properly 1,000 years ago, whereas other countries, Poland, Greece, Belgium, they've all been overrun so many times. People almost don't want to look back to their past.
That's true, I think, yes. I think, in another sense, if this is not too controversial, the English are innately conservative people who have a great faith in their traditions and the continuities of their communal life. So it just happens to be in England, which has such a thirst for ancestry.
Did you find in the writing of this book, of Volume 1, did you come across any new heroes, any new English characters that you'd not met before?
Yes, but the new heroes and were the lowly, they would have called the lowly people, the people some of which I mentioned in that brief extract, the ordinary people of England who often did very odd and extraordinary things. Kings and queens are an inevitable part of the story because they did indeed leave their mark upon the passing age. But I'm also intrigued and delighted by the antics of those who normally fall beneath the historical radar.
And how do you find them? Actually, how?
Well, you just have to read and read and read and read. I find it much better to read ancient histories written in the 18th, 17th, 16th centuries, because there the interest in detail, idiosyncrasy and quirks is much greater than in, say, academic histories of the 20th century.
Yeah.
I prefer, and I like sort of quirky histories, like histories of the Druids of London, say, or the sacred circles on Pentonville Hill, that sort of thing. I lap that stuff up because I always believe there is some sort of truth in it if you can only find it. It takes sometimes a bit of work, but there are myths and legends and superstitions which often do contain a kernel of what we might call truth.
Also, I think one of the values of those early historians, those antiquarians, is that they did tend to walk around with their eyes open.
That's right.
You know, that they weren't shut in a book or footnoting themselves into, you know, non-existence.
Exactly. No, they were genuine scholars and wandering scholars, some of them, genuine enthusiasts, genuine visionaries sometimes, who were devoted to the idea of England and who wanted to glorify it in whatever manner they could.
Just tell me a little bit, or us a little bit about your method, because I have to say, as a fellow writer, you open this as a beautiful book. You should all buy it at the end of this evening. And you open it up and there's the title page, lovely. And then opposite it, you have this extraordinary list of works that Peter has written in the past. And there are so many of them, the publisher has actually had to sort of join them together on one line, because you can't even just have a whole page of a list. How physically, as well as intellectually, how do you corral all of this material?
Well,
talk me through your working day, if that's not too delving into your personal life too
no,
much.
it's not. I don't call it a personal life. I don't. Well, I begin with the research, obviously, and I read every book upon a certain subject that I can lay my hands on, ancient as well as modern. That doesn't take. I'm quite a quick reader, so that's not as daunting a task it might seem, then I make notes in the margin of each book when something attracts my attention. And then, at the end of this long process, I sit down and write out a chronology of month by month by month by month for the period covered. And then I go back to the books and I put the various details which I've discovered in the appropriate month. And that way you eventually acquire a very long and dense chronology. And that's the way I do it.
But that's so interesting, because that's so different from many historians who have one big idea, you know, a grand sort of tablet of stone. Because in a way you're kind of jigsaw puzzling together.
I do. I'm doing it from the ground up.
Yeah.
Which for me is the only way of doing it. I have no great theories of history. I have no great theories of progress or decline or anything of that nature. I'm just trying to find something in all the coloured beads which makes a shape or a pattern.
And when you write your fiction, when you write your novels, is it a similar process?
It's a similar process. I don't see much difference between the two forms. It's sometimes considered to be a disadvantage to be a biographer, historian, novelist, and so forth. But for me, it's all the same, part of the same process. You wouldn't ask a composer, for example, to only write sonatas or only write string quartets. Music is music, you know, writing is writing. So I feel quite able, and obviously I'm willing, to engage in various forms of narrative. And when I die, if they all be put together, they'd all be chapters in the same book.
Which is the book of humanity?
Yeah, well, the book of history, the book of the past.
Yeah. I mean, it is, I think, vital, actually, that boundary between fiction and non-fiction starts to be more blurred. Because, again, I mean, you mentioned those early historians, Herodotus, and if you go back to Homer, to the singers of songs, for years, people have said, oh, you know, it was just all fantasy, but actually...
It wasn't.
It's not. Every summer there's an excavating season, more and more stuff is coming out of the ground, which proves those lines of Homer to be true, to be real.
Yeah. As I said, the first historians were poets, and I don't see why we shouldn't try to restore the poetry of history.
And in a way, perhaps also then you're also dealing in bigger truths and more essential truths, so it's not just hard fact evidence.
No. Hard fact evidence is one thing, but spiritual truth is another, if I can call it spiritual truth. I suppose I'm taking Blake's part when he said that London, for example, was a human natural wonder of God. And I think you have to have a sort of tincture of that view, that spiritual view, in order to understand the nature of English history.
And tell me what you mean by that spiritual view, because it is something which is you articulate, or it's not even articulate, it seems to be just there as a kind of
foundation. I don't know
foundation.
how to articulate it to you, because it's all done by, it's all just part of the material. I don't impose it on the material, I just let it breathe and let it come through. But it'd be impossible for me to give you a theoretical generalization about it. Any more than it would be possible for me to give you a theoretical explanation of a fiction. And it's just done, and when it's done, and I don't know how it's done.
No, but it is very interesting, this idea of having a kind of connection to people across time and space, because you absolutely get that from the pages of your book. I mean, again, without being too corny about it, they live on the page.
Well, I think that's because as a novelist, I tended to communicate, and as a biographer too, I tended to communicate with the subject by concentration. So for Blake or Shakespeare or Dickens or Turner or any of the others, you have to enter the spirit, mind, and imagination of that particular person in order to understand them properly. Now, it sounds a bit presumptuous to say I can enter the spirit of Dickens or Blake, but what I mean is I must try my best to get close to them imaginatively.
And if you can get close to people who've lived already, does this kind of work allow you to project into the future at all? I mean, you know, you're...
No, I don't think so.
You don't dabble with that?
No, I don't think that's possible.
No.
No.
I mean, it's just, I mean, again, that's very Greek. The Greeks thought all the answers lay in the past, and for them the future was this kind of Frankenstein of the gods. You didn't want to go there.
Yes.
But that can be quite different in the 21st century. Lots of people feel all the answers are in the future. That's what we should have our eye on.
Well, I don't agree with that philosophy at all.
So are all the answers in the past?
Well, the questions are... It's impossible for me to answer these questions because I don't work as I'm not a scholar, I'm just a writer, and I, you know, just do what I do.
Yes. You are quite good at it, though, I have to say. The doing what you do bit.
I've got nothing else to do.
So just tell us with this, Volume 1 is out.
Yes.
You're deep in Volume 2, or you finished
I finished Volume 2 and I'm starting on Volume 3. Volume 2 is called Reformation. Volume 3 is called Rebellion, about civil war and so forth. Volume 4 is called Revolution, about the 18th century and the so-called Industrial Revolution. Volume 5 is called Dominion, about Victoria and the 19th century. And the final volume is called Innovation, which begins the 20th century and goes up to the present moment.
And are you interested in who's reading your books? I mean, do you care?
Yes, I do care. I hope members of the public are reading them.
I suspect they are.
I don't want to be read just by scholars or academics or even other writers.
What about the next generation? Because there was a lot of talk of that with these last riots, and I think quite rightly, saying that there does seem to be a certain sector of the next generation who's caught in this kind of permanent present, who don't understand cause and effect and don't have a sense of the consequences of actions.
No, that's possibly true, and I'm amazed. I was told the other day that some history syllabuses are disappearing from schools.
They are, yeah.
Well, I thought that was a monstrous and absurd measure. If a nation doesn't understand its history, it loses its memory, and a nation without memory is a nation without identity. So we shouldn't be sleepwalking into disaster like that. No.
Well, perhaps you can join our campaign. We're campaigning to get it back. I might grab you afterwards.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Bad luck. Got some witnesses.
Oh.
But you're right, it's essential. It seems the most fundamentally important thing that young people, kids, understand. But apart from anything else, because children love stories.
Of course, that's the other point. A good narrative is better than 1,000, what you call it these days, free-for-all, what you call the thing when they have to paint?
Apps? No, I don't know.
I don't know when they're allowed to do what they want, essentially.
Yes.
I think that's absolutely so. I wasn't allowed to do what I wanted when I was growing up. I had to have a formal education.
Yeah. And were you self-taught as well? I mean, I imagine you probably read...
Yes, I was self-taught to a large extent, yeah. I didn't know anything about English history, for example.
No.
Until quite recently.
So your publishers in the audience, you probably won't want to hear that, I think.
No, what I mean to say was I studied Greek and Latin history at school, and I really didn't study much English history except at O-level.
Yeah. Would you say you're a patriot?
It depends. Yes, I presume I am. I haven't thought about it ever. I presume I am, yeah.
Well, I think that's, for me, ladies and gentlemen, that's one of the finest things from reading this book, is this sense of open-minded patriotism that comes across it. This sort of feeling, it does, that you sort of love this land that we live in. And what I'd like to do now, because actually we've been talking for half an hour, is to open it up to the audience to see if you've got questions for Peter, which I'm sure you have. If you let us know by putting your hand up very firmly, and somebody will come round to you with a travelling microphone. Peter very generously has said that he will talk about any of his books that he's written in the past, so don't feel that you have to ask him about English history. He'll deal with any questions. So is there somebody who'd like to ask the first question? somebody at the back. I'm afraid I might say gentleman or lady wrongly because I can't see, but I think it's a gentleman with his hand up, yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you for the lights.